Yes, I wonder what the limit of the brain's capacity is to create imaginary worlds and treat them seriously and make them real, and in those worlds explore and have real sort of moral, deep brainstorming sessions uh, with those entities. So it's almost like the power of the human mind to imagine taken to its limit.
It is. And the curious thing is that the same iconography, people paint their visions after ayahuasca sessions. People were painting in Europe, in the cave of Lascaux, for example, and of course they had access to psilocybe mushrooms in prehistoric Europe. There's a remarkable commonality in the imagery that is painted. I like to give credit where credit is due, and there are two names that need to be mentioned here. One is the late, great Terence McKenna and his book, Food of the Gods, where he proposed the idea very strongly that it was our ancestral encounters with psychedelics that made us fully human. That's what switched on the modern human mind. And very much the same idea began to be explored a bit earlier by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Fabulous book called The Mind in the Cave, where he is again arguing that these astonishing similarities in cave art and rock art all around the world can only be properly explained by people in deeply altered states of consciousness attempting to remember when they return to a normal everyday state of consciousness, attempting to remember their visions and document them on permanent media like the wall of a cave. So typically you get a lot of geometric patterns, but you also got entities. And those entities often are therianthropes, part animal, part human in form, might have the head of a wolf and the body of a human being, might have the head of a bird and the body of a human being, and so on and so forth, and that they communicate with us in the visionary state. Interestingly, although this sounds like woo-woo, and it is an area that most scientists would steer clear of at risk of their careers, there is very serious work now being done at Imperial College in London and at the University of California at San Diego, where volunteers are being given extended DMT. There's a new technology, DMTX, where the DMT is fed directly into the bloodstream by drip, and it's possible to keep the individual in the peak DMT state, which normally when you smoke or vape DMT, you're looking, if you're lucky, at 10 minutes. Or if you're unlucky, if it's a bad journey, because those 10 minutes can seem like forever. But with DMTX, with the drip feeding of DMT into the bloodstream, these volunteers actually could be kept in the peak state for hours. And unlike LSD, where you rapidly build up tolerance, nobody ever builds up tolerance to DMT. It always hits you with the same power. Even if you took it yesterday and the day before, and you're taking it tomorrow as well, it's still going to have that same power. There's no tolerance there. So that's how they can use that lack of tolerance to keep volunteers in this state. And then when they debrief those volunteers, they're also putting them in MRI scanners and looking at what's happening in the brain. But when they debrief them, they're all talking about encounters with sentient others. There's even a group now called Sentient Others, where people are exchanging, volunteers are now exchanging their experiences. They weren't allowed to do so at the beginning of the experiment, but now that most of them have left it, they're exchanging their experiences, and it's all about encounters with sentient others who wish to teach them moral lessons. Now, to me, that's wild. What is going on here? How do we account for this? Yeah, I get the notion of hallucinations and brightly colored visuals, but the moral lessons that come with it, those are very odd.
Yeah, and would you say that the reason that could give birth to a civilization is it because such visions can help create myths, and especially like religious myths, that would be a cohesive thing for a large group of people to get around?
Yeah, and can help us to be better members of our own community.
Right, with moral lessons.
Yeah, more contributing members of our community, more caring, more nurturing members of our community. That's got to be good for any community. I've said this a dozen times, but I'll say it again. If I had the power to do so, I would make it a law, an absolute law, that anybody running for a powerful political position, particularly if that position is president or head of state in any kind of way, that that person has to undergo the ayahuasca ordeal first. They have to have 10 or 12 sessions of ayahuasca as a condition for applying for the job. I suspect that most who had had those experiences wouldn't want to apply for the job anymore. They would want to live a different kind of life. And those who did want to carry on being a leader of a nation would be very different people from the people who are leading the nations of the earth into chaos and destruction today.
Yeah, they would be doing it for the right reasons. I mentioned to you, I recently interviewed Donald Trump and I actually brought up this same idea that it would be a much better world if most of Congress and most politicians would take some form of psychedelic at the very least.
I have no doubt that it would be a better world. I mean, this raises an interesting point, which is the role of government in controlling our consciousness. And in my opinion, the so-called war on drugs is one of the fundamental abuses of human rights that have been undertaken in the past 60 years. It should be a Republican issue. If I understand the Republican Party correctly, the Republican Party believes in individual freedom for adults as much as possible, and particularly the freedom to make choices over their own bodies. But in the case of even cannabis, I know that's one of the great things that's happening in America. It's happening state by state, where cannabis is being legalized, and that draconian hand of government is being taken off the back of people who are consuming a medicine that is far less harmful than alcohol, which is glorified in our society. We cannot say that we are free if we allow a government to dictate to us what experiences we may or may not have in our inner consciousness while doing no harm to others. And the point there is, we already have a whole raft of laws that deal with us when we do harm to others. Do we really need laws that tell us what we may or may not experience in the inner sanctum of our own consciousness? I think it's a fundamental violation of adult sovereignty. And we would have much less drug problems if these drugs were all legalized and made available to people without shaming them, without punishing them in any way, but just part of normal social life. And then you could be sure that you were getting good product rather than really shitty product, which has been cut with all sorts of other things. Ultimately, the way forward is for adults to take responsibility for their own behavior and for society to allow that to happen, and not to have big government taking responsibility for decisions that should be in the hands of individuals.
And for me also, it's exciting some of these substances like psilocybin are being integrated into scientific studies, large scales. It's really interesting.
We've seen a revolution in the way science looks at psychedelics in the last 20, 25 years. They were in that highly demonized category. But again, it's one of those paradigms which gets overwhelmed by new evidence, and it began to be realized that psilocybin and other psychedelics are very helpful in a range of conditions from which people suffer. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the fear of death when you're suffering from terminal cancer can be overwhelming, and it's been found that psilocybin can remove that. Deep depressions can be evaporated with one single massive psilocybin journey. They just go away. There's really good science on this, and they are being integrated into conventional medicine more and more. We'll see it happening. I'm not sure if it'll happen as fast as I would like to see it happen in my lifetime, but it is going to happen.
Yeah, I actually just recently found out that you had a TED Talk, War on Consciousness.
Yes.
That was taken down.
Yeah.
And that was just part of just the general resistance, because it wasn't a radical. It wasn't really a radical.
I was talking about ayahuasca, and I was talking about the view that I hold very strongly, that as long as we do no harm to others, sovereign adults should be allowed to make decisions about their own bodies and not face a jail sentence or shaming as a result. So it was a TEDx talk, not a TED Talk, organized by a local TED group. They call them TEDx talks, and I gave this talk about the war on consciousness, and it was immediately pulled down from TED's main channel with all kinds of bizarre reasons being given. But unfortunately, it was too late because a number of people had already downloaded the talk and then uploaded it onto other YouTube channels. And actually, their banning of it made it go viral in a way that would not have happened otherwise. But again, it's a sign that points of view that are not acceptable to those in positions of power are simply dismissed and shut down, or at least attempts are made to do so.
In general, just along that line of thinking, I'm pretty sure that what we understand about consciousness today will seem silly to humans from 100 years from now.
You bet it will, especially if we harness psychedelics to investigate consciousness, and that is what is happening at Imperial College right now. Is the investigation of the experience. They're not looking. There are other trials that are looking for the therapeutic potential of DMT, but in this case, they're looking entirely at the experiences that people have and why they're so similar from people from different age groups and different genders and different parts of the world are all having the same experiences.